W.E.B Du Bois was born in 1868 and grew up in a town where there weren't that many African Americans in New England. He recalled discovering that there was something different about him, as we'll read soon. He was highly educated and well known as an activist. He was the first black person to get a PhD from Harvard. Some people said that his response was, "The honor is all theirs." He was an activist. He founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a very important organization. And he was also a sociologist. He also wrote novels and poems, but his greatest contribution is probably the book from which we're reading today, called The Souls of Black Folks, where he combines different approaches like stories, personal essays, autobiography, history, and philosophy to talk about what it means to be black in America. It's a fascinating book, and I recommend reading all of it if you have the time. I think that much of what he says in that book is relevant for many other minorities, not just African Americans. And especially, this is especially true about the issue of double consciousness, a feeling that you are part of two ways of life, two ways of thinking, two different identities at once. We saw something similar in Tribal Ceremony by Janet Campbell Hale, where she's part of the Native American tribe community, but speaks a different language, speaks English. So I think there's a lot to learn from Du Bois, not just about the African American situation, but generally about what it means to be a part of a minority and right as part of a minority. And let's see how he presents the idea of double consciousness and generally what it means to be African American. Let's start looking more closely at the text, trying to see how Du Bois defines the feeling of being black in America and perhaps the feeling of being a minority in general. So he begins with, "Between me and the other world." What is this other world? It doesn't mean another planet, but he means the world of white people, of mainstream American culture. We saw Dunbar also talking about why should the world be other over wise. This is other people, but here it's more like other people who are white. There is ever an unasked question. We don't know what the question is yet, but we know it is silent. What does it signify that it's an unasked question? Why does he say that it is silent even before presenting the question? I think he is emphasizing how important yet painful this question that he's going to describe is. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy. They're too polite to approach this question. By others through difficulty of rightly framing it. They don't know how to ask it. All nevertheless flutter around it like butterflies trying to be delicate. They approach me in a half hesitant sort of way. They're not sure if they should approach him. I mean, curiously, they look at him, or compassionately, like they look at him like he's curiosity, like he's some kind of strange exhibit in a museum, or with compassion. They feel sorry for him. And then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? Here's the question, right? How does it feel to be a problem? What is it like to be a problem, a member of the African American minority? Instead of saying this directly, they say, I know an excellent color man. Color man would be the polite way to say African American in that period in my town. So, like, I have a friend who's also black. Maybe you want to speak to that. Or I fought at Mechanicsville. I was on the north side in the Civil War, i.e., I helped to free the slaves. Maybe you want to talk about it. Or do not these southern outrages make your blood boil? Aren't you angered by how the South states of the United States create Jim Crow laws that allowed lynching and separation and segregation? The questionnaire here blames only the South for racism and expects Du Bois to react to that. At this, I smile or am interested or reduce the boiling to a simmer, like become less angry as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. All these comments are just ways to ask the real question that they don't know how to ask. It's also a question that is difficult to answer. Du Bois rarely does answer, he tells us. But this chapter, and this book as a whole, might answer the question that is difficult to answer in polite society, in polite conversation. Let's think about how he phrases the question. What do you think it means to call somebody a problem? People often frame issues with minority as problems or crises. This is common today, but maybe even more so in the early 20th century and late 19th century. People talk about the immigrant problem or the racial problem, or in Du Bois' time, the Negro problem. Even if you are in favor of equality, you might frame inequality as a problem, the problem of finding more equality. A minority is often framed as a problem because its existence seems to break the harmony of society, right? If we were all white, then we wouldn't have inequality, and there wouldn't be an inequality problem, there wouldn't be a race problem, there wouldn't be a Negro problem. So the minority, even if you're trying to help it, is framed as this divergence from the norm as a problem, like a problem child. So the minority brings unquiet because they are different. They're outside of the norm. Calling something a problem puts it outside of the norm. They are also framed as a problem because they have problems. But the framing as a problem can be very problematic. It can feel dehumanizing. You are not an individual person. You are not a group of individual people. You are a problem. Or you're just a representative of a problem in society. Instead of seeing Mr. Du Bois or Dr. Du Bois, I'm seeing a black person, I'm seeing a problem. It's less bad probably than just being overtly racist, but it's still dehumanizing and objectifying. That's why questions that hint that is a problem might anger him, right? He might need to turn the boil into a simmer. And yet he does want to address the question, because answering the question what it's like to be a problem answers the question of what's it like to be an African American. In one section of this chapter, Du Bois tells us about the first time he sensed this difference, this being out of place or judged because of his skin color. And yet, being a problem, he tells us, is a strange experience. It's something not everybody knows. Peculiar even for one who has never been anything else. Like all my life I've been a black person. I've been a problem. Save perhaps in babyhood or in Europe. So the only times I don't feel like a problem is when I was a baby, when I was a small child, or when I'm out of the United States, when I'm in. It is in the early days of rollicking boyhood that the revelation first burst upon one. The revelation, the seeing that he was different, all in a day, as it were. I remember well when the shadow swept across me, the shadow of this difference. I was a little thing, away up in the hills of New England, in the wee wooden schoolhouse, in the small schoolhouse. Something put it into the boys' and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards. 10 cents a packet, which might have been quite expensive back then, sort of collecting cards, and exchange them. The exchange was merry till one girl, like we were happy, we were having fun. I was having fun till one girl, a tall newcomer, somebody who didn't know him his entire life, refused my card. Refused it peremptorily with a glance. I just like ignored him completely. I don't want anything to do with you. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different, right? This I realized the difference from the others, or like mayhap, perhaps, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. So maybe we're the same in our hearts and in what we want, in our longing, but there's a difference, there's a veil, there's a screen between me and all the other children, between me and other people who are white. So African Americans who grew up in an African American community maybe had different experiences. But for Du Bois, he really remembers the shock of the first realization of difference. And for Du Bois, at least it's an experience of rejection and racism. He feels his difference, that there is a veil between him and others when the girl refuses to play with him. Du Bois gives an answer to what it was like to be a problem. This is not an essential way of being black. It's not what it means to be black. It's not like every black person in the world has this experience because they are black. Instead, it's an answer to what it is like to be a black person in a racist society, what it means to be uh, different, marked by difference in a world that does not accept this difference. Let's read from the third paragraph. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, this is a list of major races some anthropologists would talk about in the beginning of the 20th century. The Negro is a sort of seventh son. The figure of the seventh son comes from fairy tales, folklore. He's often the one left behind, the smallest one, the poorest one, but eventually is maybe successful. Born with a veil. So some babies are born with a caul on their head, like a kind of membrane, and in folklore they are believed to have something special about them. So in some places, people believe that they might become werewolves. Here he describes it a little differently. And gifted with second sight in this American world. Gifted is a little ironic here. It's a kind of curse, but maybe it will turn into something a real gift at some point. Second sight is like a sixth sense, the ability to know more than others, to see more than other. Let's see what he means by second sight exactly. He's going to explain. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness. So in this world, in this American world, in this white American world really, society does not enable him to have his own unique identity, to really know who he is, but instead to have a split consciousness or a double consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. How can a black person know themselves? From what perspective? How do you look at yourself when you're black, according to Du Bois? Black people can only know themselves from the perspective of the white world, of the other world. This is this double vision where you see yourself from outside, or second side, where you see yourself from outside. They know themselves, they form their identities with the idea that of what others think about them. So I think this is to some extent true of all people. We learn who we are through how other people react to us. This is why it's very important when you're teaching not to put certain expectations on certain students, because they're going to live up to your expectations. So this is true about people in general, especially when they're growing up. But according to Du Bois, it's especially true when you are a problem, part of a minority. It can seem like, and it was even more true 100 years ago than it is today probably, all representations of your group are created by others. You learn who you are only from others, not from yourself, not from people like you. So you are judging yourself, you are assessing yourself, you know who you are, you know what's expected from you, not from your individual desires and thinking and dreaming, but from what others say to you. And Du Bois says it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. Here he mentions it in a sentence, but it has become a term of analysis, for analysis. This phrase, he explains, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul, inner self by the tape, like a measuring tape, of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. You are not one with yourself because your identity is built up of other people's perceptions of you, and these perceptions are not flattering at all. They either are pitying, thinking that you are weak, or filled with contempt, thinking that you are not good enough, that you are not their equal. One ever feels this two-ness, right? This doubleness, this two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls. Like instead of being one person, you're two things: American and a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconcilable strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Right? It feels like almost like a split identity. That is almost so this split is so powerful, it's tearing his body apart. Just the fact that the body is so headstrong, that so dogged, and so strong in itself, that keeps the body together. So you belong to, or your thoughts belong to two groups: the mainstream white society and the minority. The mainstream society might hate and belittle your minority identity, but you still believe in what they stand for, and accept some of the bad, evil things that they say about your group. And anyways, these two groups have two different interests, two different strivings. You feel like two people in the same body, and it tears you apart. Du Bois explains. It's very dramatic. You can almost imagine it like a cartoon character being torn apart from within because of some kind of possession. And that's how he describes it. He wants it to feel dramatic. How does it feel to be a problem? It feels like being torn apart. Double consciousness is the key term here. He can be an individual because he is made up of two warring structures: the hegemonic mainstream white American thought pattern and the black thought pattern that he. Another way to talk about this is as internalized racism, thinking of yourself in the racist terms that the dominant society thinks about you, looking at yourself from the outside, almost like you're looking at yourself as an object. This is a very fraught, self-injuring position to be in. It's a double consciousness, as it describes it here, is not some kind of gift. It's not an ability to know more. It's actually a very painful position. In the ending of this chapter, Du Bois is optimistic about how this two-ness, how this doubleness can have some positive results. So right now it's very painful, but maybe it might turn into a gift. African success in America can be good for all Americans. And doubleness, which is painful now, might give the nation some strength and diversity, power. Later in his very long life, Du Bois gives up on this hope of a more equal, more harmonious American society, and in fact, he moves to Africa towards the end of his life, really giving up hope for the US. He died in 1960, only when at the time when America was starting slowly to move towards more equality, though it hasn't really been achieved even today. To sum up the main point about double consciousness, in existence as a black person in a racist society is defined by others. They are defined, African Americans are defined by other people, white people, as different and even inferior. The black person is always a stranger even in his own country. If you are black, you look at yourself through the eyes of the white world, according to Du Bois. You internalize their judgment of you. This creates a sensation of double consciousness, almost like being two people at once. This is a deeper injury than the idea of wearing a mask, as we read in Dunbar's poem. When you wear a mask, you know who you are, but you hide it. You know how you're feeling, but you hide these feelings. You suffer for hiding your identity or your emotions, but at least you know what they are. You know who you are. You know what you are authentically feeling. In Dunbar, you even have God as your witness. In Du Bois, the situation is worse. The doubleness of identity, of consciousness, is internal. You don't know who you really are exactly or where you belong because you believe the bad things said about you or believe anything that is said about you, and you don't know really who you are authentically beyond being somebody's problem. The Dunbar poem and Du Bois' essay are similar in describing doubleness, but this doubleness in Du Bois is even deeper, more insidious even, more troubling.